Hi, today we're going to talk about street art and other alternate methods of painting and doing mixed media with your painting. And so we'll start with Miss Van. Miss Van is a muralist and street artist, and this is a mural that she did in Miami. There is an art district where there's lots of art galleries called Wynwood District. It's a neighborhood of Miami, and there all of the galleries have commissioned one of the artists that they represent to do a mural on the side of the building. And so Miami, particularly that neighborhood, is just filled with murals. So if you ever get the chance to go, I really highly recommend it. This is a piece by Margaret Kilgallen and Barry McGee, and you're also going to be watching a video today in which they are highlighted and they talk about their work and their reasons for making street art rather than traditional kind of artwork that you would see in a gallery, and they do some of that as well. Since that was made, Margaret Kilgallen, they were a couple and they were also a team that painted together. Margaret Kilgallen has passed away since then, unfortunately, but Barry McGee is still working. She passed away really young. It's a pretty sad story. But this is a piece that they made. You can see that it includes kind of illustrative painting as well as tagging. Here's a Banksy, and he uses a stencil technique. I will show you how to create your own stencil in my demo. You could also do this. Another kind of element that you'll see in street art is the use of repetition. This is Shepard Fairey. I believe it's a silkscreen, and he puts many of them together and all across the city, right? And so, for example, you sometimes in a larger city than here, maybe downtown. I don't think I've seen this in Pittsburgh, but in a lot of large cities, you'll see the same poster for an album or a movie or anything, concert that's coming, one next to the other, next to the other, next to the other, to make it noticeable. And so that's something that street artists have also incorporated into their work at times. Shepard Fairey, the person who made that last one I just clicked away from, is also the person who made the Obama Hope poster. This is a work by a street artist who goes by Space Invader, and you can see why he goes by that name, and he works with assemblage. And assemblage is when you take a three-dimensional object and adhere it to a two-dimensional surface. So it's very much like collage, but collage is a flat thing on another flat thing. This is a three-dimensional thing on a flat thing. And so here we have tiles adhered to a wall. You can adhere things to your canvas. For this project, you don't have to paint on canvas. This is the first one in which you could paint on whatever you want, or which paint or whatever techniques you want to include with this. I'd like your piece to have at least a little bit of hand painting in it, since this is a painting class, and I want you to learn how to incorporate paint with these other techniques. Here is a collage that shows kind of a fun thing you can do with collages. If you have a bunch of the same image, you can cut them up and stretch them out kind of in the way that it was done on the right, or you could print them kind of small and then a bigger one and a bigger one and a bigger one, make it look like the thing is kind of shooting out forward towards you. There's so many different things you could do with collage, particularly if you have multiple of the same image, which you could obviously create with printing. This is nice. Swoon, the artist who goes by Swoon, she creates her own artworks on paper in the studio and then later collages them onto walls. If you want to work on a wall for this project, it's fine. Obviously, if you work on a wall, you won't be able to bring it into class. So in that case, for your grading, you'll just have to document it really well. Excellent photographs of it so that I can see what it looks like, unless of course the wall is near campus. Don't get yourself arrested, paint on walls where you have permission. Or if you do paint on walls you don't have permission, just don't tell me about it, okay? I don't want to know. All right, another thing you could do for this project is to design a pattern and then incorporate that pattern into your artwork, you know that I design patterns. Kehinde Wiley also designs patterns that he has in his artwork. It's a kind of a popular thing at the moment. This is a fashion designer, Ikeri Jones. He is out of Philadelphia. He's contemporary, and he, I think, is originally from Nigeria. And he creates these patterns that are reminiscent of kind of Nigerian fabric, and then designs men's wear blazers and trousers out of them. So when you're mixing media, it's very important to remember that oil paint can go over acrylic, because acrylic is very much just like primer, right? Your primer is made of acrylic. And it can go over spray paint, it can go over Mod Podge, but none of those things can go over oil paint, because oil paint is kind of shiny and cures, right? So anything above it would just crack off eventually, or not even adhere in the first place. So you really have to plan out the order in which you use multiple media. If you're incorporating anything else that's not oil paint with your oil paint, do those things first, do the oil later, okay? Or just be really good about separating them on your canvas and not overlapping the different sections of the canvas. So your assignment is to make an artwork that incorporates painting and uses one of the techniques. You can use any kind of paint, any method, has to have some painting in it, and one of the things we learned about today. Okay, now for my demo. Before I move on to the demo, I just want to mention one interesting thing that happened in relation to street art this year. And this is being filmed in 2020. So this mural had existed downtown for years, and it was at this point a little bit worse for wear. It's a mural by Kim Beck, a local artist, and she was commissioned to paint this, so it was sanctioned by the city. And you know that a lot of street art is not sanctioned, it's just done anyway. Like in the video that you're going to be watching with Margaret Kilgallen and Barry McGee, they talk about why, you can see them sort of running away from the police at one point in that video, but they talk about why they make art out in public, and it's because they want art to be seen by the masses and not just people who go to art museums. But oftentimes street art can also be used to show a message of a political nature to a larger group of people. And so something like that relates to that happened in Pittsburgh this summer, which was very interesting. This mural had been there for a long time, and then this summer I was walking down, this is below Point Park, right across the water from the stadium on the north side. This is in Pittsburgh, the peninsula part, right underneath of Point Park. So this summer I was walking down there and I saw this mural had been partially covered, but not entirely. You could still see these plants through the letters by the words Black Lives Matter, and they were painted in big block letters that were red. And I thought that was really cool. But then later there was a controversy came out over that, because it turns out that it was painted by 6 white artists, and police had come to kind of like check out what they were doing, and they didn't arrest them or anything, which is not often the case. That would happen if you know, a black person or a person of color was making kind of unsanctioned street art. And so the people who were painting that mural, there were 6 of them. 2 of them were Connor Clark and Joshua Krajnak, and the other 4, I couldn't find their names in the reporting. I think a lot of people don't want to put their names out there to reporters in relation to unsanctioned street art, because it's something you can get arrested for. But anyway, so the police came and said, you know, what are you guys doing? And they said, you know, adding to this mural, and they just kind of walked away and leave them alone. And so when that came out, a number of black artists in the city, led by Cameron Nesbitt. He is the partner of Camara Towns, and she came and spoke at the university last year about her work. And so some of you might have actually met him, because he came to the lecture and the dinner afterwards. So he led the charge to have the mural have more black artists involved in it. And so the mural changed again. It started like this, and then just the block letters were there. And then once he got involved, he invited a large group of Black artists from across the city to add to it. And so when I first saw this, it didn't have any of the illustration, the portraits, the snakes, the flowers that were added to it. It just had the original kind of Kim Beck gray scale plants kind of peeking through the letters. And then over the coming weeks, he was interviewed quite a bit by the press, and he brought up the point that a lot of the time it's harder for kind of Black artists to get kind of sanctioned gigs in the city that are paid, and often, you know, they are these people who do street art are, you know, bothered by police when they're doing it in a way that these white artists weren't. And so the city sanctioned another project where you know, Black artists came and added to this. And so you can see this. These are actually all in one big row. It's not stacked like this, but this photograph was stacked like this so you could see it all at once. It would be really small if I had it that horizontal across the whole thing, that horizontal across the PowerPoint. All right. So here's a group of artists that came together to work on it. I could not find online everybody's name, but Kim is the one who led the charge here. And here is another view of it. What's really cool about this mural, and I hope that you all go downtown and check it out, is that every single angle of it looks differently. And so it's nice to look at it up close and be able to walk around and see what's happening on all sides of the columns. But then it's also nice to go across to the north side and look back at it and see the whole thing at once. And here it is again. And one thing that I find really cool about this, besides the message, which is of course very important too, is that all of the artists who were involved at every stage are very happy with the end result. And so even Kim Beck, the person whose original mural was painted over twice, you can still see a little bit of her original work peeking through there. She came to check it out and said, you know, how she thought it was really great. And the guys who had done the block letters, the white artists who had done the block letters before they were painted on top, also ended up kind of befriending Kim, and he, you know, basically said it was great that they got it started, and he was going to take it from there and finish it. And those artists who originally did the block letters are also the ones responsible for this installation / mural across the street from Target. So if you've been to Target, you've noticed this Say Their Names mural, and it has the names of most of the high-profile people who were Black who were murdered by police. There's only 3 in this particular image of it, but if you go there, there's 3 stacked in all of the different sections of the fence that go all the way around in a 3D way. So that's one other thing about street art. It's something that you really need to see in person, because it's hard to get a photograph of something that could possibly be that large, and, you know, possible to be seen from multiple angles. And so these would be 2 great field trips for you to take on your own at some point in the city, to go just right across from Target, and the other one's right below Point Park. And there are just so many murals across the city, and also, you know, more unsanctioned street art. And I hope that now, as you go about your days in the city, you'll start to look for these things. I mean, think about above what is it, like a Wiener Shop downtown, they have that mural of Andy Warhol and Andrew Carnegie getting their hair done, and there's just a number of really cool murals all across the city. If you go downtown, that would be a great spot to start, because there's at least 4 or 5 of them there. And if you plan to actually take a trip around the city, I'd be happy to give you some recommendations about spots to hit. So I'm going to start by talking about pattern design. I talked in the lecture about this brand, Ikere Jones, and it is a brand that was founded by Wale Oyedije and Sam Huber. They both live in Philadelphia, but Wale was from Nigeria originally, and he designs the patterns, and Sam does the tailoring, I believe. And so they also make these amazing pocket squares. So you can see, this is one that I purchased, and of course I'm not going to wear it, but I have it hung up here because I don't want anything to happen to it. It's such a beautiful image. I just think of it as a piece of artwork. And so here we can see that some of the flat patterns are featured against people actually wearing the fabric. And so you can see a voluminous version of the fabric against a flat version of this one up here. And he has featured these kind of Nigerian figures against a Baroque style of background, which is really interesting. It kind of speaks about his kind of Nigerian background mixed with his American upbringing here. And I think it's a really beautiful piece, has some really interesting lighting in it as well. His patterns have been featured in the movie Black Panther, so I'm sure you have seen his work before, even if you've never heard of him. So I just think this is such a kind of an interesting piece in terms of the space within the room, but also like the use of patterns and the use of kind of aesthetics from different parts of the world. Now let's talk technically about how to design a pattern. So I design patterns for my own paintings, and I always start with a tile. So this would be an example of what a tile looks like. And so with a tile, everything where it ends on one side begins again on the next side, and that's what creates the repeat. You can see how this leaf ends here and then it carries on over here. This rosebud ends here, carries on down here. These leaves that are falling down finish falling down up here. All right, and that's the case with all of my patterns and all patterns that repeat within these tiles. And I'll show you how to make a tile in a moment. First, I want to show you how I translated these tiles onto some of my paintings. This is the first pattern I ever designed. It's of those little strawberries that grow in your yard, the ones that are too tiny to eat and really sour. And you can see I left a lot of space in the middle here, and that created kind of almost a gap. So it's almost like rows here. Whereas with some of my later patterns, they're a little bit more continuous all throughout. Now, so what I would normally do is take the square, photograph it or scan it as flatly and perfectly as possible, and then I put it into Photoshop and create this repeat. You can see it with some other ones. Like for instance, pattern of Salsify. Here is the tile. I photographed it flatly, put it into Photoshop, and just stacked them all next to each other, creating this. And you can see that I then projected an image of the repeated pattern. So I took this and projected it onto my canvas, and then I traced. Here it is. I traced it on with pencil and then I painted it. So this became this, and I painted it over and over and over. This tile of roses became this pattern that you see here. This one was really difficult to paint because it was hard to see the pencil marks that I had created because of all the fluctuation of the gradients in the background. It goes dark, light, dark, light. It was so hard to see my pencil marks. And this pattern is here. So you can see how I actually translate these tiles into my work. Over here, the black pattern that is over the blue in the background is from this. All right, so all I really need to design a pattern is a piece of paper, Scotch tape, scissors, or you can cut it out with your X-Acto knife, something to draw with. Let's say I'm not gonna design something amazing. I'm just gonna show you technically how to do it right now, okay? So let's do something simple like a paisley. So I'm designing a paisley pattern. The key to starting is not to let anything touch the edge. And this is important because it will affect the repeat. You want everything to repeat seamlessly forever. So this is part of making that happen. So you can draw whatever you want in the middle. Designing a paisley here, so let's do so. Put a heart in there. Let's have a flower. Just doing whatever I want to do right now and not letting things touch the edge. I'll be back once I get it a little bit further filled in. Okay, I'm just finishing up this first part of the drawing where I don't touch the edges here. And so for this one, I just chose to do a paisley because paisley is really quick to design. It's very recognizable. And it's something I can do relatively easy for just showing you how to create the repeating pattern. But if this was for an actual painting, I would try to think about what patterns would make sense with my painting in terms of symbols, in terms of aesthetic. And if I thought that paisley was an appropriate, possibly an appropriate design to create for my repeating pattern, I would certainly then think, okay, when was paisley originally designed? Where was it designed? What was its purpose? Because the viewer, of course, is going to, if they're knowledgeable about that, they'll read that into the meaning. So do be thoughtful about the patterns that you design for your own paintings. Okay, so you'll note here I got close to the edge, but I didn't touch the edge. I didn't break the picture plane, so that's totally fine. I just don't want to go over the edge of it. Put in a last few things here. How about a green heart maybe? And then we're ready to move on to the next part. So we're going to get close to the edge everywhere, but not actually go over it. All right, so you see nothing broke the picture plane. The next thing I want to do is fold it in half perfectly so that it's totally 50-50 and extremely straight. We want to do this as perfectly as possible. So really line up those corners. And you'll fold it the other way too. All right. And making it as perfect as possible is going to make your repeat work. All right. Now I'm going to take my scissors and cut along this edge. It might be useful if you have a ruler to lay down the ruler and pull the X-Acto knife. That might give you a more perfect edge. So I'll be right back as soon as I've cut this. Okay, so this was my pattern and I've got it cut into 4s now. And it's very, very important to do this in the right order. You are going to switch the corners diagonally and you're not going to turn them as you do it. So this would be wrong if you were to turn it. You need to keep it in the exact same orientation, but just switch the locations. So like this. And like this. Okay. Now when we put them back together, there's a lot of open space, empty space in the middle. All right. But we need to tape them back together now. And so I need to flip this whole thing over, and I don't want to get them out of order when I do that either. So what I like to do is take something like a book, or I can use my sketch pad in this case, and lay it down, grab them in the right spots. I could just lay it on there in the first place when I do the flip. Flip it like a pancake. All right, so you know that it's still in the same order as it was, even though we're looking at the back white. All right, so now we're gonna tape it back together. And this is why it was so important to cut it as perfectly as possible and to fold it as perfectly as possible, because otherwise it won't quite align. I'll be back once I have the whole back taped back together. So I finished taping it back together, and now I just flip it over, and you can see everything I drew before is now at the edges, and I have the middle available to keep drawing. So let's stick with this paisley theme, I guess. Add a little bit more, And the important thing, again, is never to touch the edges, okay? So I don't want to draw anything now that overlaps the edges either. So I'm gonna continue my drawing just like I did last time, and I'll be back. Okay, so now I have things everywhere in that second group of drawings. I again didn't touch the edges at all. So now how do I turn this into a repeat? You can see that this perfectly does. This part right here aligns with this little edge here. This lines up with this, where this stops. This starts over here. I can't see what you're seeing exactly there. There we go. And so this is a perfect repeat. Now, what I would need to do next is scan this so that I could digitize the image and then put it into Photoshop. And as I stack them in Photoshop, one on top of the next to the next one, next to the next one, keeping them all in the same orientation, not flipping them or anything, but just stacking them one next to the other, next to the other, it will create the repeat. Kind of like what you see here. I showed you that I did that in the past. And so this is just this tile next to itself, next to itself, next to itself, with itself above, with itself next to that, next to that, next to that, and above and above and above and to the sides. It's just the same stacked like a checkerboard everywhere, and it creates the repeat. Now, if you don't have a scanner, like I don't have a scanner at home, what I often do is just use I would just lay this flat on the table, and I would take my tripod and just shoot the phone straight down at it, and I would make sure that I had my phone right in the middle so that it's not like closer on one side than the other, which would create a warp, because you really want it to be perfectly straight, flat photograph. What I used to do before I had a tripod, I got the tripod to film these videos, but it's really cheap. You can get one online for just like 30 bucks. But before I had that, I would take 2 jars that were the same size, put them above on either side of the tile that I made here. These are called tiles. And then I would just lay my phone across it and set the timer to go off in 3 seconds. And so this is doable even with kind of just a phone and some paper. Okay, and you all have access to Photoshop this semester through the Adobe license that the university purchased for you. If you do not like using computers, if you don't want to use Photoshop, you could design your tile and then get, this is the same size as the paper, but just get much larger tracing paper than this, and you can trace it onto your tracing paper over and over and over. And then you'd have to find a way to transfer it from the tracing paper to your canvas. That can be a little bit tricky, but one thing you could do is use graphing paper, but just actually making it digital is a lot easier, I think. Okay, one warning, regardless of how you're going to turn your tile into a multiple, you are certainly going to want, when you have a really light color like yellow, just to outline it, because when you project that onto your canvas, you probably won't even see it because it's so light and close to the color of the white. So anything light, I would outline just so that way you do not miss it when you are tracing this onto your canvas. This doesn't relate to your homework because you don't have enough time to do this given that you have a week for this project. But I want to show you something else I've been doing with patterns lately that involves technology. And so I realized that I could create a pattern and not have to paint it like 100 times on my canvas if I did the detailed painting in the beginning. And so this is another painting that I made earlier this year. And so for this pattern that I designed, I isolated in Photoshop just the head and the stem around this orchid. And I did watercolor paintings of this and this. I can never say this, chrysanthemum, and these roses. And then I created a repeating pattern in Photoshop from those, and I just washed this so it's a little It's not quite as bright as it was before, but I had this printed onto cotton, which is pretty cool. And then I had my model wrapped up in that cotton, and I took the flat pattern and had that as the background. This is a Photoshop image that I had printed onto canvas. And so you can see I have the the voluminous wrapped up material from the photograph that I took of him against the very flat image that was originally printed onto that material and my model himself. And I realized that if I use this image, I could just lighten him up in Photoshop because I want to paint him in instead of having him be a photograph. But if I lightened him, then I wouldn't have to project the image of him onto there and then trace it in pencil because it's already there as an outline for me, which is pretty cool. And so there's all kinds of different ways to work with patterns. But I used the exact same method when I designed this. I created a tile. I isolated these images, these three, the other one goes underneath there, the three flowers. I put them into Photoshop and created a kind of a digital tile. And then I repeated my tile, and it created this really cool pattern that I designed for use in this painting. All right, so part 2, I'm going to show you how to create a stencil like what Banksy does in his work. So first you find an image, find something, find a person. Try to find a bigger face maybe. Here's somebody. Let's use this woman. So what we're going to do is actually cut out the parts that we want to be the image. So we can think about this. I'm looking at her. Do I want to cut out light areas or do I want to cut out dark areas? And that depends on what she's going to be stenciled on top of. So if she's going to be stenciled on top of a dark background, then I might want to pull out the highlights that I see here. If I had many copies of this, if I were to, for example, go to the one of the computer labs on campus and print out 4 or 5 different versions of this, I could cut out different sections for each page that would be different colors of the stencil. Very much like the way screen printing works. But let's just say this is going to be an image, just one color stenciled, and it's going to be on a very dark surface. So I think I'm going to cut out the light areas. Now I have to be sure to cut them so that I don't cut through and have big blobs kind of working together. So that'll make sense. I think it'll make a little bit more sense once I get a little bit further in here. So remember, I'm just cutting out what I want to be light. So here I'm cutting out her hand, and here's the side of her face. And if I didn't want them to be together, this is what I'm talking about. If I didn't want this highlight in the side of her face to run into this hand highlight, then I'd have to stop at some point and have a little dark mark between them, okay? So I don't mind if they do, but let's say I did. And then I would go up to this edge, leave a space, and then have the hand separate. So now you can see there is a little gap between where I cut off in her face and where her hand is, and that would be dark because it would be made of the dark background. But let's say I am pretty sure that the viewer will figure out what's going on and I don't have to have that there because I'm going to get it really pretty graphic. So I'm going to pull out highlights in her hair, and I might even pull out some highlights that don't exist here just to show where the edge of her hair is. Because my, oops, tore a little bit, I have to tape that up. You can see what I'm working on here is a cutting board for my kitchen. At school, if you work in the studio, we have those really nice rubber cutting boards, those rubber
nice matte rubber ones. If you're at home, you can just wash a cutting board from your kitchen, make sure there's no oil on it, and then you should be able to go in and cut on top of that without, you know, creating any oil slicks on your page. So, cutting out the highlights in our hair now. And remember, when you cut with the X-Acto, it helps to pull towards you, so you get a really distinct edge. So I'm cutting out the highlights that I see in her nose. And that goes into her forehead. So I'll pull that right around. Now, let's say I had a highlight here, and I had a highlight here. Then if I were to put this highlight in here, the whole part would fall out, right? Because it would be kind of highlighted all around, and that middle part would fall out and I wouldn't see any of her features. And so it's important to leave those gaps in some places, so that way you could have one continuous piece where the whole head won't fall out. I'm going to get a little bit further along here, and then I'll come back and show you what I can do with this. So when you are making a stencil and it has lots of really close together little cuts like this one does, sometimes you'll have to repair it. So you could see up here it snapped off, but it was going to be kind of dark against dark, the part that's not going to be printed, right? Because I'm going to be printing the light stuff is where the holes are. So I just stuck a piece of tape on there, no problem, because that whole part is supposed to be blocked off anyway. But in here, you can see I had to tape up where a little tiny, tiny strip tore in a couple places. So I've got tape there now, and tape will block my my ink from going through where I want it to be big open space. And so I put the tape down, and now I just go in with my X-Acto and I pull the tape away in the places where it's not meant to be. Oops. Do it on both sides before I try to lift it up. Okay. So now the tape is going to be stuck to my X-Acto board. I'm sorry, to my cutting board, but I can just peel it up with my X-Acto knife. Okay, and now it's back together, and there's only tape in that tiny little area where I wanted it to be repairing that tiny bridge. All right, so I said I was going to print light on a dark surface, so I made my surface dark behind. I want to show you an example of what I was trying to describe earlier. You see how there is a bowl on the table here? If I had actually made the highlight on the ledge of the bowl go all the way around, the whole middle of the bowl would have fallen out. And that's why it's important that I left some little gaps here. I think that's a really clear example of what I'm talking about here. So here I didn't have the hole cut out. Here the hole isn't cut out. So that middle part remains intact, okay? So when I am stenciling with paint, I'm going to use acrylic here. You can use oil, it doesn't matter. You need to use a really flat-headed brush, so that way you can get the paint applied in blotches straight down. You definitely do not want to apply paint by dragging, because the paint will just go right underneath the edge of my stencil. So here's what I'm ready to do now. I could probably use this stencil more than once. Each time using it though, it's going to be a little bit worse for wear. If I wanted a mirrored image of this, I could just turn the stencil around backwards and it would create a mirrored image. I'm not putting too much paint on the tip of my brush, and I'm holding down the parts that flip up. There we go. You may have wondered when you looked at people's work that is out in the street, like Banksy, but really detailed, how in the world they get such detail while they're out doing graffiti without getting caught. And the way that Banksy does it is that he creates these stencils in advance back in his studio. And so when he's out, he only needs to spray paint them. He holds them up, spray paints them, and is able to then quickly leave. Most of the work is done in the cutting out process. You are welcome to use spray paint if you don't want to do this kind of stenciling like I'm doing right here. I'm using acrylic. You could use oil, it doesn't matter. If you want to get a spray painted effect with paint out of your tube, you can do that by watering down your paint quite a bit, getting it just on the tips like you have here. Mine's not watered down, so it probably won't get the same effect. And then spraying the tips. So mine's not spraying too much right now because I have really thick paint on here. But if you just water it down, it would certainly spray out. You could also use a toothbrush for that and get a spray paint effect without the spray paint. I'll be back when I'm done with this. Okay, so at this point I have the whole thing covered. I'm thinking it might be cool to add a gradient though, so I'm going to take another paint. It's a pearlized kind of gold toned paint. I'm going to add a little of that here. Oops, I guess I never opened it. Take this off. All right, I'm going to add a bit of that to my palette. And it's so easy with this tapping method to get a really easy gradient. So I'm just going to get a bit of gold on the end. I'll have maybe her head in gold. And then have that fade out as it mixes with the white further down. Can make her face look really nice and warm. I imagine, I hope. Okay, let's see if it worked out. I'm hoping I didn't get too much paint underneath the edges because I have lots of very fine edge work here. So when I take this up, I want to do it straight up, maybe rolling it a bit. And there we go. So you can see, there she is. So I used an image of somebody from a magazine, but for your own artwork, that was just for the demonstration. For your own artwork, you're going to want to use your own photograph if you intend to make a stencil and do a Banksy kind of style image. So let's say you're home and you don't have a printer to print out your photograph to do the cutting and everything. Something else you could do, just pull an image up on your computer screen. Like here I have an image. And I could wait, I can't do this right now because it's so bright out, but as soon as it got to be dark, I could take a piece of paper, it's like regular printer paper, stick it on top of this, and at nighttime, this would really glow through. It would act like a light box, and you'd be able to see the image through. And if you're not able to see the image through even at night, or if you go into a closet to do this, something you could do is just turn up the light on your computer to be really quite glowing. And then you should be able to see it through the printer paper and be able to just trace the image that you see with a pencil or pen, and then you'll have the image available to do the cutting out. I should also say you should not press very hard because you don't want to actually mess up the screen of your computer. So next, let's talk about collage. I know that you probably are thinking, okay, I know how to do collage. You cut something out, you paste it on, and that is basically it. But I want you to think about not just pasting foreground objects onto a surface, but also think about how to incorporate other elements of the photographs that you may take. So again, I'm just using a magazine, but you could take your own photographs for this and print them if you have a printer. If not, there's one on campus. If not, you can also use ones from magazines too, but it's harder to find the right image if you're looking at a magazine than it is to just go take a photograph of something. So looking at this, I could certainly cut out the woman or the wine and paste it on, but I think it might be fun to play with this ivy in the background. So I'm gonna cut this out. I should really be doing this against my cutting board, but just to keep it going quickly. I don't actually care about this magazine. So what I'm suggesting here is that you can cut out background areas or anything from an image and then combine it with another image before applying it to the surface. You don't have to just cut something out and apply it to the surface. You can do all kinds of things. So here I found this back cover of this magazine, people having some kind of fancy cocktail party, like, this is wonderful, we're all so rich. What a great time. So we can combine that image with what we see here and make something very surrealist if we so desire. So I'm going to cut out her wine glass. And maybe I'll cut her face out. Let's see that. Just go nuts here. And maybe this painting behind her can go too. And now we can take some of the things that I cut out before. I cut out the sky. The sky could be the painting and maybe her face. And I see I'm gluing these together in the back then. Maybe her face is the foliage and her glass is full of grapevines. Now we've got something really kind of interesting and surrealist going on here. And I could certainly then cut this out. I mean, of course I tape them together or glue them together in the back first. And then I could cut this out and apply this to my surface. And of course I cut these out too. Surprised that cut didn't go all the way through. Ah, so many levels. Right, and so now I have a very different kind of image than the things that I started with here. Maybe I'll apply that to my surface. Okay, now I have my piece all taped together in the back, ready to go. Could I add it to this oil painting? Nope, I could not. Why? Because the oil painting is made out of oil and you can't apply acrylic or Mod Podge on top of oil, as we talked about before, but you could certainly apply it to, if this were an acrylic painting here, I could certainly apply it to that. And of course I can apply it to my gesso. My gesso is basically made out of acrylic. Some people like to apply Mod Podge with one of these guys. I do not. I like to use the same kind of brush that I use for stenciling. I always say Mod Podge, but it's actually Mod Podge. This is the stuff. You could also use glue. I think Mod Podge works a little bit better. So we want to get this applied to the back. Up to the edges. And it makes sense to apply a little to my surface too. And if this were acrylic painting, we could go right over top because the Mod Podge dries clear, and so you'll be able to see your painting through it. Good, a nice thin coat, thin as key. Okay, I would put this in water. And I would first adhere that all together. I have such a hard time getting the bubbles out of these. I know some people are able to do it much better than I am, but I always get this bubble issue. So the way that I like to handle that is to kind of use my fingers to burnish it. You know, just push the air out to the sides, push the air out, push the air out, get as flat as possible. And I'm getting some Mod Podge on top as well, and that's totally fine because I'm going to use that to seal the top in. And then I could paint acrylic on top of this. Could also paint oil on top of this because we can apply oil to the tops of things but not to the bottoms. I mean, we can't apply, sorry, acrylics or Mod Podge to oils. Okay, so the important thing now is to just keep smoothing it down. It's going to want to pop up, so this is going to take some time. You need to kind of keep smoothing it and wait until it is dried and adhered. Not going to make you watch me do that though. Now let's talk about assemblage. So let's say that I want it to look like my tennis ball is coming through the canvas. Remember we said that assemblage is when you adhere something that's three-dimensional to a two-dimensional surface. So if I wanted to make it look like this was coming out of a wall, for instance, I could just cut it in half and super glue it or epoxy it to the wall. It would be a lot easier than actually doing it to a canvas. So I want it to be sturdy. I wouldn't want it to like kind of crack and come off the canvas eventually. So I do have a theory about how I might be able to accomplish this. There's all kinds of different ways to do assemblage. The name of the game is just getting it on there so that way it won't fall off. Hello guys. All right, I've got my half tennis ball that's gonna look like it's coming out of the canvas. So I have a thought about how to make that happen. I'm going to trace around it. I always thought the inside of a tennis ball would be full of rubber bands. Don't know why I thought that. And I'm going to cut this out. I'll be right back. Great, so if I was going to adhere this to the surface without cutting that hole out with just super glue, then it would only be attached at this tiny little edge, and I'd be afraid that that would kind of come off one day. And so I think it makes more sense to adhere it to something that is kind of harder and flat like this, that's not going to be bending and, you know, maybe like cracking the paint. And so I'm going to apply it to this little piece of super thin wood that I got at a craft shop. And once I have it attached to this, then I could put super glue all around this edge, stick it through, and adhere this whole surface to the back of the canvas. Really doesn't take long to get super glue to stick something together. So now I have this, and I have this hole in my canvas. Let's see how it'll look when it goes through. It will look like it's coming right out. So it's exactly what I want it to look like. And now I can apply super glue around this and have a whole lot bigger area of the surface attached to the canvas than if I were just to do that edge. And the other good thing about this is that I can also apply it to the back of the canvas, and so I'm not putting some kind of adhesive on the front. You know, I'm leaving the front just available for paint. So I'm not sure how the super glue would interact, but probably wouldn't be a big deal. But I do think that this particular way of doing it is going to make it a lot stronger than if I had just applied the ball to that kind of warpable, movable canvas. I'm so afraid to get this on my fingers. If you've ever gotten super glue on your fingers, then you know the kind of havoc and problems that could come of it. You can get super glue or epoxy at Lowe's, any hardware store. Okay, Moment of truth. Let's see if this works. It's dripping. Okay. I only have to hold it here for about 15 or 20 seconds with super glue. I really need to get that off my chair. Let's see. No hands. Looks good. Okay, you can see here that it didn't align exactly perfectly, but that would be okay. What I could do now is, oh, and it's starting to press against this. So when you add something to the back, you have to make sure you don't press so hard that it dents the canvas. This is a really cheap prefabricated canvas. Yours will be better than this. That's why I'm using this canvas for the demo, because it's expendable. But anyway, what I could do now is go back in here with my primer, which is my gesso, kind of fill in this little ledge. Fill it in over here as well, let that dry. You know, put on the gesso pretty thickly, let that dry for several hours, and then you can go in and paint right up to the edge then, okay? So that wouldn't be a problem. Other things you are allowed to do in this project, besides incorporating collage, assemblage, stenciling, like you've seen here today, into this, would also be to paint in a kind of illustrative style, to incorporate tagging, you know, create your own sort of tag. You could also work with the idea of multiple images, but none of these things really require a demo. They're all pretty straightforward. And so if you have any questions, please let me know, and see you soon.